I sat in that cold, wood-paneled courtroom, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. My lawyer, Denise, leaned in and whispered, "Stay calm, Lisa. They're watching everything." Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one on trial for being a black mother. Across the room, my ex-husband, David Sterling, sat in his crisp navy suit, all confidence and privilege. He didn't even look at me. Just kept his focus on the judge, Richard Whitmore, an old family friend, of course. The kind of man who shook David's father's hand at charity galas and played golf at the same country club. I knew this wasn't going to be a fair fight from the start. David had painted me as some irresponsible, unstable woman, the stereotype they always use against us. He said I worked too much, that I didn't provide a proper home, that our son, Jordan, would be better off in his care. Never mind the fact that he was barely around when we were married. Never mind that I was the one who stayed up with Jordan when he had nightmares, the one who packed his lunches, who knew which stuffed animal he couldn't sleep without. And yet, here I was, having to prove that I was good enough to keep my own child. David's attorney, a slick, gray-haired man named Franklin, stood and adjusted his tie before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, my client is simply seeking what's best for his son. Mr. Sterling has a stable home, financial security, and the ability to provide Jordan with every opportunity. We're concerned that Ms. Bennett, while undoubtedly a loving mother, may not have the resources to ensure Jordan's future." I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from reacting. This wasn't about resources. It never was. Denise stood, her voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, my client has been Jordan's primary caregiver since birth. She has a stable job, a strong community, and a loving home. We have witness statements from teachers, neighbors, and family members who can attest to her ability as a mother." She placed a stack of papers on the judge's bench, but I saw the way Whitmore barely glanced at them. His mind was already made up. David finally spoke, his voice smooth, calculated. "I just want what's best for my son, Your Honor. That's all." Liar. I wanted to scream, to remind everyone that David hadn't cared about what's best until I filed for child support. That he didn't even fight for shared custody when we divorced. No, this was about control. About making sure I knew my place. The judge let out a long sigh and adjusted his glasses. "We will take a short recess before I make my ruling." I barely heard him. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. This was it. I could feel it slipping away. Jordan. My baby. I turned to Denise, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to take him." Denise hesitated, then placed a hand over mine. "We still have a chance." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But across the room, David smirked. He knew the game was rigged in his favor. And so did I. I paced the courthouse hallway, my heels clicking against the marble floor, my hands trembling, despite my best efforts to steady them. The air smelled like old paper and stale coffee, but all I could focus on was the weight pressing against my chest. I could barely breathe. Denise sat on a bench, flipping through her notes, but I could see the tightness in her jaw. She was just as tense as I was. "Lisa," she said softly, motioning for me to sit. "You have to keep it together." I couldn't. Not when I was about to lose my son. Down the hall, David leaned against the wall, laughing at something Franklin had said. Laughing. Like this was some game he'd already won. I hated him in that moment. Not just for what he was doing to me, but for what he was doing to Jordan. My baby didn't belong in David's cold, perfect world of private chefs and business trips. He belonged with me. Where he was safe. Where he was loved. The bailiff called us back inside. My legs felt like they didn't belong to me as I walked to my seat. Judge Whitmore settled into his chair, clearing his throat. "I've reviewed the arguments presented today," he began, his voice as dry as dust. "And while it is evident that both parents love their child, the court must prioritize stability and long-term well-being." My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming. It is this court's decision that primary custody of Jordan Sterling be awarded to his father, David Sterling. Ms. Bennett will be granted visitation on weekends. The words slammed into me like a freight train. No. Denise shot to her feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect." "The ruling is final," Judge Whitmore cut in, already moving on. Just like that. Like he hadn't just ripped my heart out and handed it to a man who saw Jordan as nothing more than a trophy. I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. David stood, buttoning his jacket like this had all gone exactly as expected. Franklin patted him on the back, whispering something in his ear. Probably congratulations. My body felt numb, but my mind screamed. This couldn't be happening. Jordan wasn't just some prize to be won in a courtroom run by men who had already decided my fate before I ever stepped inside. I gripped the edge of the table, willing myself to stand. You can't do this. My voice barely made it past my lips, but I didn't care. He's my son. Whitmore didn't even look at me. Court is adjourned. David finally turned to face me, his expression calm. Too calm. I'll make sure Jordan gets used to the transition as smoothly as possible, he said, like he was doing me a favor. I saw it then, the victory in his eyes. He didn't care about Jordan. This was about me. About making sure I never forgot that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how good of a mother I was, men like him could still take everything from me. Denise was talking, but I couldn't hear her. The courtroom was spinning, closing in. I had to get out. I shoved past the rows of polished wooden benches and stumbled out into the hallway. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. I had lost. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Or so I thought. The world blurred around me as I staggered into the courthouse hallway, my pulse a wild, erratic drumbeat in my ears. I wasn't sure if I was breathing. Couldn't tell if my legs were even holding me up. I just knew that everything had changed in an instant. Jordan was gone. A sound clawed its way out of my throat, something between a sob and a scream, but I swallowed it down. Not here. Not in front of him. Denise was right behind me, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Lisa, listen to me. We can appeal. We have options. Options? The word felt like a joke. What options? The judge had barely glanced at my side of the case. He had already known who was winning before we walked through the door. What chance did I have against men who shook hands behind closed doors and made deals over expensive scotch? I pressed a fist against my chest, as if I could physically hold myself together. Breathe. Just breathe. Down the hall, David and Franklin were still talking, still laughing. David didn't even glance my way as he strode toward the exit, his gait smooth, victorious. He had already moved on. Why wouldn't he? He'd won. I thought about Jordan, my baby, my heart, my whole damn world, sleeping in his race car bed at home, his stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. He didn't know. He didn't know that when he woke up, I wouldn't be the one making his breakfast. I would only see him on weekends now. Weekends. Like I was some distant relative, a guest in his life. Not his mother. A deep, trembling rage took root in my chest, stronger than the grief. I wasn't going to accept this. I turned sharply to Denise. What's next? She hesitated, reading my face, then sighed. We can file a motion to appeal, but it's complicated. Custody rulings are hard to overturn, especially when they're based on stability arguments. I gritted my teeth. Stability, the polite way of saying a rich white man's money mattered more than a black mother's love. Denise kept talking, laying out timelines, legal jargon I could barely absorb. It all felt so distant, like she was speaking through glass. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone watching me. A woman stood near the entrance to the courtroom, wringing her hands. She was petite, maybe late 40s, with soft brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her face was pale, uncertain. But there was something else in her eyes, hesitation, guilt. Recognition hit me like a slap. Maggie. David's old nanny. She used to watch Jordan sometimes when he was with his father. I barely knew her. David handled all of that, but I remembered the way she looked at my son, the way she spoke to him gently, like she actually cared. And now, she was staring at me like she had seen a ghost. Our eyes met, and she took a hesitant step forward, then stopped herself. Like she wanted to say something but couldn't. A weird shiver ran down my spine. Denise must have noticed, because she leaned in. Do you know her? I nodded, still watching Maggie. She took another step, then stopped again, chewing on her lip. She was scared. Scared of what? Before I could say anything, Maggie turned and walked away, fast. Like she couldn't get out of there quick enough. A warning bell rang in my head. Something was wrong. And suddenly, I had the sinking feeling that this fight wasn't over. Not yet. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jordan's face, his bright smile, the way he hugged me so tight before bed, like he never wanted to let go. But this time, when I reached for him, he slipped through my fingers, disappearing into a life I couldn't reach. A life controlled by David. When the sun finally dragged itself over the horizon, I was already dressed, gripping my phone like it held the answer to everything. I needed to do something. Anything. Denise had been clear, appeals took time, and time was the one thing I didn't have. Jordan's world was about to change, and I had no idea what David would fill it with. I couldn't sit and wait for a system that had already failed me. I needed leverage. And I had a feeling Maggie had it. By noon, I was parked outside a small, brick-faced apartment complex on the other side of town. It was a far cry from David's gated mansion, but it was neat, quiet. I double-checked the address Denise had pulled for me, then took a deep breath and stepped out of my car. Maggie answered after the second knock. The moment she saw me, she went pale. "Lisa?" Her voice was small, wary. "What are you doing here?" I studied her face, the way she clutched the doorframe, her fingers twisting against the wood. She was nervous. "Good. I need to talk to you," I said, keeping my voice even. "It's about David." At the mention of his name, her whole body tensed. She glanced down the hallway, then back at me, like she was afraid someone was listening. I don't think that's a good idea," she muttered, starting to close the door. I pressed a hand against it. Not forceful. Just enough. "Maggie, please. I lost custody of Jordan yesterday." Her breath hitched. She already knew. And if she knew, then she also knew exactly what kind of man David was. I softened my voice. "You worked for him. You saw things." I hesitated, reading her expression. The guilt was all over her face. "I think you want to help me. But I need you to tell me the truth." For a moment, she just stood there, her fingers gripping the door so tightly they shook. Then, something inside her seemed to crack. "Come inside," she whispered. Maggie's apartment was small but tidy, filled with soft, warm colors. The kind of place that felt lived in, unlike David's cold, sterile house. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands curled around a mug of coffee, even though she hadn't taken a sip. I watched her carefully. "You were going to say something yesterday, weren't you?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was afraid." I nodded, waiting. Giving her time. She swallowed hard. "Lisa, you don't know everything about David." I clenched my jaw. "I know enough." She met my gaze, and what I saw in her eyes sent a chill down my spine. "No," she said softly. "You don't." And then, she told me. Told me about the nights David came home drunk, mean, dangerous. How she had to step between him and Jordan more than once. How he barely even looked at his own son unless there was someone around to see it. And then she told me something worse. Something that made my stomach turn. David had been violent. Not just angry. Not just cruel with his words. Violent. And Maggie had seen it firsthand. She took a shaky breath. I thought about reporting it so many times, but, she shook her head. He has power. Connections. People who make things go away. I sat frozen, my pulse roaring in my ears. This was it. This was what I needed. If Maggie testified, if she told the court what she had just told me, David's perfect, polished image would shatter. The judge wouldn't be able to ignore it. I reached for her hand. "Maggie, I need you to come forward." Fear flashed across her face. "Lisa, you don't understand. If I do this, he'll come after me." I squeezed her hand. "Not if we make it too big to bury." She hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she nodded. And just like that, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The courthouse smelled the same, old paper, worn-out carpet, the stale breath of too many lives being decided in cold, indifferent rooms. I hated it. But this time I wasn't walking in beaten. This time I had a weapon. Maggie walked beside me, her hands shaking as she clutched a folded statement Denise had helped her write. She was terrified, but she was here. That meant everything. Denise met us at the entrance, eyes sharp, lips set in a determined line. I filed an emergency motion this morning. My stomach twisted. Will Whitmore even allow it? A flicker of something dark passed across her face. He won't have a choice. The moment we put this on record, it'll be public. If he tries to suppress it, he risks his own reputation. I exhaled slowly. Good. Let him squirm. Inside, David was already seated at his usual spot at the plaintiff's table, looking bored. He had his phone in one hand, Franklin murmuring something in his ear, likely assuring him this was just another inconvenience. A minor delay before he walked away with my son. Then his gaze lifted, and he saw Maggie. His entire body went stiff. Yeah, you didn't expect this, did you? For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something that almost looked like fear in his eyes. Whitmore entered, adjusting his robe as he sat. His expression barely flickered as he glanced at us, but I caught the tension in his shoulders. He knew. Denise stood. Your Honor, I am filing an emergency motion for reconsideration of custody based on new, critical evidence. Franklin was already shaking his head, rising to his feet. Your Honor, we object. This case was settled. Ms. Bennett cannot drag us back into court simply because she doesn't like the outcome. Denise didn't even blink. The court's primary concern is the well-being of the child. And if Mr. Sterling is an unfit parent, that ruling must be reconsidered. David leaned forward, voice sharp. This is ridiculous. What could possibly? And then Maggie stood. The room went silent. Whitmore eyed her warily. And you are? She swallowed hard, then squared her shoulders. Margaret Calloway, Your Honor. I was the nanny for Jordan Sterling when he was with his father. A shadow flickered across Whitmore's face. Maggie gripped her statement in both hands, knuckles white. I came here today because I can't stay silent anymore. She turned slightly, looking straight at David. I know what kind of father he really is. David went pale. The courtroom shifted, the air electric. Denise gestured toward Maggie. Your Honor, Ms. Calloway is prepared to give a sworn statement regarding Mr. Sterling's history of violence and neglect, particularly toward his son. Whitmore hesitated. Violence is a strong accusation. Denise didn't waver. And it's one we're ready to prove. Maggie took a shaky breath, then looked directly at the judge. I saw him shove Jordan. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. I saw him throw things, glass, plates, when he was angry. He drank too much, and when he did, he didn't care who was in the way. Jordan was terrified of him. The words hung in the air, like a bomb that had just been detonated. Someone gasped. A murmur rippled through the room. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Miss Calloway, are you willing to testify under oath? Maggie nodded, voice firmer now. Yes. David shot to his feet. This is a lie. His voice cracked slightly, panic creeping in. Gone was the cool, collected businessman. In his place was a man who was realizing, maybe for the first time, that money and power couldn't silence everything. Denise turned to the judge. Your Honor, in light of this testimony, we request an immediate reevaluation of custody. We also request a child welfare investigation into Mr. Sterling's treatment of his son. Franklin scrambled to cover for David. Your Honor, this woman is a disgruntled former employee. She quit, Denise snapped. Because she was afraid for Jordan's safety. Whitmore shifted in his seat. He was cornered, and he knew it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a slow breath. This court takes allegations of abuse seriously. His voice was measured, careful. I will order an immediate investigation. Until that is concluded, custody of Jordan Sterling will be returned to Ms. Bennett. The air left my lungs in a rush. I had one. David slammed his hands on the table. You can't do this. Whitmore barely looked at him. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck. And just like that, Jordan was coming home. I don't remember walking out of the courtroom. 1 second, I was frozen in my chair, heart hammering as the judge's words echoed in my ears. The next, I was standing in the hallway, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I had one. The words didn't feel real, not yet. After everything, after fighting a system built to break women like me, after sitting helpless as they tried to steal my son away, I had won. David stormed out behind me, his face flushed with rage. This isn't over. His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the barely restrained fury under it. You think you won, Lisa? I'll bury you in appeals. I'll make sure you never see another dime in child support. You won't be able to afford a damn thing. I turned slowly, my pulse steady now. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. You think I fought this hard because of money? I met his eyes, holding them. Jordan isn't a paycheck to me. He's my son. David scoffed, shaking his head. You're nothing. You're just some bitter. Denise stepped between us. Walk away, David. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharp as a blade. Unless you want to dig this hole deeper. David clenched his jaw, nostrils flaring. For a second, I thought he might actually lunge. But then, his gaze flickered past me, to Maggie, who stood behind us, arms wrapped around herself, eyes wary. And just like that, the fight drained out of him. Because he knew. He had already lost. With a final glare, he turned on his heel and stalked down the hall, Franklin scurrying after him. I let out a slow breath, my body trembling with the effort of keeping myself together. Denise touched my shoulder. Let's go get your son. When I pulled up to Jordan's school, the weight pressing against my chest finally started to lift. I could see the kids spilling out of the building, backpacks bouncing, voices high and excited. And then, there he was. Jordan. His small frame, his bright eyes scanning the parking lot, looking for someone he thought wouldn't be there. And then he saw me. Mommy? His voice was barely above a whisper. I got out of the car so fast I didn't even shut the door. I dropped to my knees just as he ran into me, his arms wrapping around my neck, his tiny body clinging to mine like he was afraid I'd disappear. I held him tight, pressing my face into his soft curls, breathing him in. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. He pulled back slightly, his brows furrowed. Daddy said I was gonna live with him now. I cupped his face, my hand steady for the first time in days. Not anymore. His eyes searched mine, and then, slowly, his face broke into the biggest, brightest smile. So I get to come home? I nodded, tears finally spilling over. Yeah, baby. You get to come home. He laughed, a real, pure, happy laugh. And just like that, the world made sense again. That night, Jordan curled up in his bed, his stuffed dinosaur clutched in his arms, already drifting to sleep. I sat beside him, running my fingers gently over his forehead. I thought about everything it had taken to get here. The fear. The anger. The fight. The way they had tried to paint me as something I wasn't, the way David had almost won just because the system was built for men like him. But I had fought. And I had won. Because I was Jordan's mother. And no one, no judge, no lawyer, no rich, powerful man, was ever going to take him from me again. I kissed his forehead softly, whispering into the quiet. I love you, baby. Always. And as I sat there in the glow of his nightlight, listening to his steady, peaceful breathing, I finally let myself believe it. We were home. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.